There's a room they never talk about on the third floor of the old Sacred Heart Hospital in Hays County, Kansas. It doesn't appear on any of the blueprints, not even the ones held by the diocese. The nurses didn't mark it on their rotation. Sheets orderlies avoided it with the unconscious precision of men who'd learned the rules without ever being taught. It was just a short hallway that ended too early. A wall where a door should have been, and beyond it, something that made the floor colder, something that made your ears ring as you passed by. If you grew up in Hays after the war, you probably had someone in your family who stayed at Sacred Heart. It was the only real hospital in a 60-mile radius, built with quiet money from the church and bricked together by men who didn't ask questions. One elevator, 5 floors, white tile, wood-paneled waiting rooms, hallways that echoed like chapels. It was a place that expected you to be quiet, not out of respect, but out of fear that too much noise might wake something. They say it started with the children. That's usually how these things begin. A girl named Miriam in 51 was the first to talk about the room. She'd been in for a bout of scarlet fever, nothing serious. But she wouldn't stop crying when they wheeled her past the third floor wing. She said the wall was watching her. She said there was someone behind it breathing, counting. By the third day, she refused to eat. Nurses reported her staring at the hallway for hours, lips trembling like she was trying to mouth a prayer she didn't know the words to. She bit one of the orderlies who tried to pull her away from the window, broke skin. They transferred her to the psychiatric ward in Topeka a week later. The wall had no name, but it developed a reputation. Instruments would glitch near it. Thermometers gave false readings. The floor tiles warped faster there, no matter how many times they were replaced. Light bulbs popped more often. Cleaning crews left that hallway for last, and only in pairs. No one knew who first suggested it wasn't a wall at all, but the stories began to align. A hollow behind the plaster, a breath of air when no window was open, an outline just for a moment in the corner of your vision, and always that deep, pressing silence. The kind that made your skull throbbed on in 1953. A war veteran named Charles Greeley was admitted with shrapnel wounds that never properly healed. He was delirious on morphine when he was wheeled past the blocked door. He sat up, stared at the wall, began to cry, said I left him in that field. It wasn't supposed to follow me. He died later that night. The nurses said his body twisted, unnaturally at the final breath, like he was being pulled by something. That's when the room started earning nicknames. The confession cell, the cleric's den, God's quiet era. No one could agree what it really was. Some said it had been part of the original structure before the hospital expanded. Others claimed it wasn't part of the hospital at all, that it had always been there, even before the first brick was laid, that the church knew, that they had built around it on purpose. The priests assigned to Sacred Heart never stayed long, always rotated. Always a new name on the door of the chaplain's office. One, Father Dwyer, was found sitting outside the hallway late one night, hands folded like a statue. His eyes were open, but he wasn't blinking. They said he stayed that way for hours. When he finally moved, all he said was, "It doesn't like prayers that aren't whispered." Then he left. No farewell mass, no formal transfer. Gone. There were rumors about what happened if you knocked on the wall. Some said you'd hear it knock back, but not right away. Hours later, in the middle of the night, just once, slow and deliberate. Some said the sound didn't come from the wall at all but from inside your own head, a pressure behind the eardrums, a tick in your heartbeat, a second shadow where none should be. In 1954, a young intern named Robert Finch drew the short straw. During night rotation, the hospital was short-staffed and someone had to take vitals on the psych overflow patients stored temporarily on the third floor. He laughed it off, called the stories bunk. Said he'd kiss the wall goodnight if it meant getting his residency. Faster, he made it halfway down the hallway before the nurses heard him scream. They found him curled beneath the supply cart, muttering about a man in white standing inside the wall. A man with no face, just pale skin stretched tight over bone, and hands too long to belong to a human being. Robert didn't speak again after that. He was institutionalized in Missouri the following month. In his notebook, hidden under his mattress, they found a single phrase written over and over. "It's not a room, it's a wound." After that, the hallway was quietly shut. Not officially, there was never any announcement, just a broken bulb no one fixed. The cart always left parked across the way. Eventually, the hallway was omitted from tour rounds for new interns, then from the inspection reports, then from memory itself. But there were those who still remembered. Janitors spoke of hearing footsteps in the hallway when they were alone. No echo, just one set. Slow dragging. There were reports of patients being wheeled too close, screaming uncontrollably, their heart rate spiking, their eyes fixed not on the hallway but on something within it, something invisible and magnetic, something they couldn't unsee. Sister Bernadette, the oldest nun at the hospital, told one nurse in a moment of uncharacteristic weakness that she'd once seen someone open the wall. Not a door, not a latch, just an opening that hadn't been there before, a kind of shifting in the plaster, a thin split from floor to ceiling, like a mouth peeling open. She wouldn't say what came out, only that it smiled at her, that she never smiled again after that. In 1956, the hospital changed hands. Management shifted from the diocese to a secular trust. New administrators came in, budgets were reevaluated. And that's when the nightmares began again. The new director, a woman named Elaine Breckner, ordered the hallway renovated. She said there were too many inconsistencies in the blueprints. Claimed they were wasting space. The construction team went in with hammers and crowbars. It was supposed to be a one-day job. They left after 2 hours, white as ghosts. One refused to speak. Another pulled out his crucifix and kissed it until his lips bled. They said the plaster was wrong. Said the wall wasn't hollow, nor was it solid. They said the tools didn't work right, swung back at them like they were being resisted. Elaine insisted. She went in herself. Alone, she came out 30 minutes later, smiling too wide, not a word spoken, not a report filed. The renovation was cancelled, and from that point on, Sacred Heart was never quite the same. People started vanishing. Not patient staff, orderlies on night duty, interns caught between rotations. A radiologist who wandered too far looking for a lost chart. Their disappearances weren't announced, but those who'd worked there long enough noticed. Nameplates quietly removed, lockers emptied overnight. No one asked. No one dared. In spring of 1957, the janitor assigned to clean the third floor refused to go near the west hallway, not after what he saw. A nurse named Lillian, known for her pragmatism. Her cold refusal to engage in ghost stories, had been mopping the corridor near the forbidden hall. She stopped to adjust a bucket, and in that moment, heard a soft scratching sound behind the wall, faint, irregular, like bone on brick. She stood frozen for what felt like minutes. The sound didn't stop. Then she said, very quietly, "There's someone trapped in there." She ran and she never returned to work. The janitor who told the story, an older man named Frederick, with tobacco-stained teeth and a voice like gravel, claimed he saw Lillian weeks later, standing just inside the stairwell. She didn't speak, she didn't blink. Her hands were folded neatly in front of her as though waiting for something. He said her eyes were hollow, not blank, but hollow, like they were looking past him at something that wasn't supposed to be there. Frederick handed in his resignation the next day. Sacred Heart kept operating. That was the strangest part. The hospital didn't shut down. Patients came and went. Births and deaths occurred. Cafeteria lunches were served. Prayers were said. X-rays taken. Bones mended. Life continued on like a river running over the corpse of a buried town. But for those who worked there, truly worked there, something had shifted beneath the surface. They knew that the west hallway wasn't just abandoned. It was active, breathing, like something beneath the floorboards had teeth. In October of 1958, an elderly priest named Father Kavanaugh was brought in after suffering a stroke. He was one of the last original spiritual caretakers of Sacred Heart. Retired now, speech slurred. They placed him in a quiet ward near the chapel. But something changed in him after 3 nights. The nurses found him sitting bolt upright in his bed, eyes fixed on the corner of the room where shadows gathered unnaturally. When they approached, he pointed toward the hallway. He couldn't speak, but he scribbled a single word again and again onto a page. "It's open." That same night, every light on the west hallway blew out simultaneously. And for the first time in almost a decade, the sound of a door creaking open echoed down the empty corridor. The nurses who heard the door open that night didn't speak of it at first, not because they weren't afraid, but because they were afraid in a way that felt personal, shameful, as though the sound itself had known them, had reached into a private part of their memory and touched something they'd never told anyone. The hallway remained dark for days. No electrician dared fix the breakers. Then came the night of the red mist. It was a Tuesday, late September. A nurse named Evelyn had just finished checking vitals in the maternity ward. As she passed by the staircase to the 3rd floor, she stopped. The air had changed, grown metallic, damp like old blood. She saw it then pouring slowly down the stairs, a mist, thin red. It didn't behave like smoke or steam. It rolled with intention. It hugged the walls. It descended. She stood frozen as it reached the linoleum floor and spread in a perfect semicircle toward her shoes. Then, just before it touched, the fire alarms began to scream. But there was no fire, no smoke, just silence and that red haze. By the time the maintenance crew arrived, the mist was gone, but something else was missing too. Room 329. The room existed on every blueprint, every census, every patient log, but physically it was gone. Where the door had once been was now smooth-walled, as if it had never existed. Inside that room had been a child 10 years old, a boy named Matthew. He had pneumonia. He was there the night before. Evelyn swore she gave him juice. His chart vanished. His bed vanished. His name was not in the system. But Evelyn remembered him, and the last thing he'd said. Sometimes I'd hear them praying inside the wall. She repeated that phrase to herself for hours, days, weeks, until she was found sitting in the west hallway, hands folded like in church, eyes staring at the wall where room 329 used to be. When asked what she was doing, she whispered, confessing to what no one ever found out. That year, Sacred Heart's death rate tripled. Elderly patients were found lying in contorted shapes, A nurse hanged herself in the stairwell. An infant vanished during a thunderstorm. No broken locks, no broken windows, just a crib still warm and a silence no one could speak into. The west hallway was finally sealed, not with construction tape, not with doors, but with bricks up like a tomb quietly at night. No paperwork filed, just a cinder block wall where the corridor once was, covered with plaster and paint so that it disappeared entirely from sight. But the hospital staff knew. The wall didn't seal anything, it only silenced it. For now. Years passed. The hospital modernized. Sacred Heart added new wings, fluorescent lighting, better surgical equipment. Photographs of smiling nurses were placed in the foyer. An artist was commissioned to paint a mural above the chapel doors. Children in a meadow, lambs in their arms, sunshine over rolling hills. The west wall was forgotten by design, but not by everyone. In 1964, a young intern named David Lancer began a project cataloging hospital anomalies for his research thesis on patient neglect. He noticed a strange discrepancy. While walking the third floor one afternoon, he counted the rooms: room 327, 328. Then suddenly 330, no, room 329. He checked the floor plans. It was there. Checked the records. Dozens of entries, but physically it wasn single quotes T. David asked questions he shouldn't have. He was called into the administrator's office and told, politely but firmly, to leave the old floors alone. Focus on his rotation. There are reasons, they said. Some things don't need to be re-examined, but that night, curiosity won. He returned to the third floor with a flashlight and a crowbar. He knocked along the west wall, listened to dull thud, 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 and then, hollow, the sound changed. He began chipping away at the plaster. Slowly the crowbar struck something solid: brick. He pried again. One brick gave way. Then another. Behind it, darkness. But it wasn't the darkness that made him stop, it was the smell. Not rot, not mold, something older. Something sterile but suffocating. The smell of unventilated prayer, as if the very air had been sealed with intent. He pointed his flashlight inside and saw them. Faint carvings on the inner bricks, crosses, Latin phrases, childlike scrolls etched deep into mortar. Symbols of warding but not ones taught in any seminary. Symbols that twisted and looped like vines around each other, like someone had scratched them in while sobbing or screaming or both. Then, just as he leaned closer, he heard breathing, not from the room, from inside the wall. Slow, rhythmic, as though something had been asleep and was now waking because it had been noticed. He stumbled backward, flashlight clattering. In his panic, he covered the hole as best he could. Didn't stop until he reached the chapel, locked the door behind him, and for the next 3 hours, he wept. He withdrew from the hospital the following day. David would later describe it, in his unpublished memoir, as the closest I've ever come to touching the memory of hell. The west wall remained sealed, though not untouched. Over the decades, new nurses would report things they could never quite justify. A noise during their rounds, an odd pull in the air. A whispered word they couldn't understand, in Latin, sometimes in a child's voice. One was allowed to speak about room 329, though by now it had become legend. Some believed it never existed, the invention of stressed staff and poor record-keeping, but others, usually the oldest nurses, the ones who had been there in the 50s, avoided the third floor altogether. They called it the quiet hall, and they always crossed themselves when passing its stairwell. In 1978, the hospital underwent its last major renovation. During demolition of the West Wing, construction workers unearthed a sub-basement that was not on any map. It was filled with waterlogged journals, broken gurneys, and rows of rusted metal cribs, each with straps. One wall was entirely covered in rosaries, hundreds of them strung together with what looked like human hair. The foreman quit the job the next morning. Records of that discovery were never officially filed. The new administrator had the sub-basement bricked up just like the west hallway, and yet, even now, so many decades later, locals speak of Sacred Heart as though it still breathes. The building has changed hands, closed and reopened as a rehab facility, then a veterans clinic, then abandoned, but the third floor remains intact, untouched, not even vandals break in. The graffiti stops at the second-floor stairwell, and if you stand in the west lot on a windless night, when the cornfields have gone silver under the moonlight and the Kansas soil has dried into pale skin, you might hear it. Not footsteps, not cries, but a slow, wet tapping just behind the wall, like something gently knocking. From the inside, some say it's the sound of something old trying to be remembered. Others say it's the last patient of Sacred Heart, the one who was never discharged, never buried, never fully human. The one who learned too much in room 329 and never, ever aged.